On the short-term impact, I think U.S. sanctions policy is going to be critical. U.S. sanctions currently limit the amount of Venezuelan oil going to the U.S. market, with one exception for Chevron, which has a sort of legacy access to Venezuelan barrels. If there's a broader lifting of sanctions on Venezuelan oil, the U.S. could absorb some of the oil that is currently going to China. That would be a big shift in global oil flows, and it would impact Canada because we compete with Venezuela essentially for the same market on the US Gulf Coast. But overall, that would be a fairly small impact. The bigger question, I think, is the longer term. Can Venezuela get back to where it was 20, 25 years ago when it was producing roughly four times as much oil as it is right now? That would require political stability, a new government, probably a new petroleum law, and security. And those conditions, if they can be achieved, which is a big if, would in turn potentially attract investment from some of the big global oil super majors, from the US in particular, to reinvest in Venezuela and try to bring back some of the fields that have been underinvested and are aging and have saltwater corrosion and missing pipelines and all kinds of things, and potentially bring on new fields as well. But I think that long term will take several years to play out. So I think it's going to take some time before we see a big change in Venezuelan oil supply beyond the oil that's already in the water. I think the situation in Venezuela will have an impact on Alberta. Um, I think potential increase of Venezuelan exports to the US if the Trump administration changes its sanctions policy towards Venezuela. Um, that would mean more competition and potentially lower prices, moderately lower prices for Alberta in the US Gulf Coast market in the short to medium term. That could be about 500,000 barrels that would swing from China back to the US if Trump changes the sanctions policy. And that would mean more competition for Alberta. I think that will reinforce the case for a pipeline to the West Coast because as long as Alberta is dependent on the US as the only real major market for its exports, we're vulnerable to supply shocks and demand shocks in that market. And we would like to have diversified markets. Um, so this probably will help reinforce the case for a West Coast pipeline. But of course, it won't provide any solution on its own to the questions around the role of indigenous consultation or environmental questions or questions about the opposition from the BC government, which will still have to be managed. I think, Gordon, the only thing I would say is that China is clearly a big part of this, that, China and Russia had strategic interests in Venezuela and in many ways tried to step in for the US when the US companies left 20 years ago. And now here we are at the same time that Canada is looking to build its own pipeline links to the Asia Pacific market, with China as the largest customer over there. Um, what's interesting ultimately is that there's only so many places in the world that can process the Venezuelan oil or the Canadian oil. And it really is the US, it's China, it's India. And I think that because we in Canada are producing heavy oil, we're exporting a lot to the US, we're starting to export more to Asia Pacific. We will be affected by these events in Venezuela that will impact the prices and demand and supply and trade flows for this particular type of crude.